Beneath all this beauty lurks a beast.
It truly is alive, and it's so immense.
There will be a very large-scale supervolcanic eruption from Yellowstone. That's a fact.
An eruption equal to 1,000 nuclear bombs. Nature's ticking time bomb, Yellowstone, one of the most popular tourist attractions in North America.
An eruption like Yellowstone could trigger the end of civilization as we know it.
For over a century, tens of millions of visitors have marveled at Yellowstone's breathtaking scenery. It's America's first national park. But Yellowstone's beauty is only skin deep. What's threatening lies just beneath the surface. We get a glimpse of it several times a day from Old Faithful. This famous geyser shoots 32,000 liters of boiling water 18 stories straight up. A tourist attraction, but far from benign. Yellowstone National Park is recognized as one of the largest volcanic systems on Earth. A supervolcano, one that erupts about every 600,000 years. The last major eruption was 640,000 years ago. So, is it overdue? There have been disturbing signals. Possible warnings of another eruption that have scientists concerned.
Suddenly, the ground was going up. There's some source down there moving around.
2,000 earthquakes over a few-week period.
We see magma moving at depth. We see an increase in the geyser activity. We don't know.
And then there are high concentrations of gas, which killed 5 bison a few years ago.
They weren't in a typical death pose, kind of like a cat that's curled up. It looks like they'd just fallen over. We think it was just a very cold night, very still night. The geothermal gases accumulated, and the bison just basically dropped where they stood.
The risk to humans is very real. With 3 million tourists hiking through the park every year, rangers regularly check for gas buildup.
Again, we're very cautious with where we put these boardwalks. We've not had any human fatalities due to the gases, but the animals are allowed free rein to walk wherever they want to.
The Yellowstone supervolcano is sitting on what geologists call a hotspot. Unlike other volcanoes in the world, Yellowstone isn't cone-shaped with a crater at the top. Instead, it has a flat caldera, an oval depression in the earth, 80 by 50 kilometers, 2/3 the size of Prince Edward Island, formed during Yellowstone's last major eruption. You can be standing on the caldera, not realizing you're standing in what is really the crater of an active volcano, one that could be overdue for another eruption. But it's not something tourists who come to Yellowstone to see the bison know much about.
I didn't realize it was a volcano.
All that activity going on underneath our feet.
So it's way overdue, is that right?
Yeah. Well, everything is overdue, right?
The Yellowstone supervolcano is very much alive. An eruption could be the largest natural disaster in recorded history. In our lifetime, we have nothing to compare it with. The Icelandic volcanic eruptions in 2010 and 2011 grounded flights around the world and cost the airline industry billions. They don't even come close to Yellowstone's potential.
A super eruption of Yellowstone, let's say, would be equivalent to the impact of a 1-kilometer size asteroid.
Unlike an asteroid, though, an eruption at Yellowstone would explode from deep within the Earth, spewing a deadly mixture of lava and ash.
which will come out of the volcano and destroy everything in its path.
In one scenario, 1,000 cubic kilometers of ash erupts from a Yellowstone supervolcanic blast.
1,000 cubic kilometers is enough to bury the state of Texas about 5 feet deep.
It'll be roughly the equivalent volume of the size of Grand Canyon twice.
And it won't just be ash.
This is a bomb. This is a bomb actually from Mount St. Helens, 1980 eruption. And when you're fairly close to the volcano and you get big glops of magma, lava that end up in the air, then they cool literally in the air and then come down as a big, heavy, solid chunk. In the case of Mount St. Helens, some of these bombs were this big or this big, but we've certainly seen in other places bombs that are as large as a house.
These bombs are mixed with tons of ash. University of Toronto geologist John Westgate tracks ash samples from around the world. It isn't like smoke or other dust. It's not until you see ash under the microscope that you can truly appreciate the danger.
If you look under the microscope to see these glass shards, they're very angular, very pointed. Certainly, if you breathe this stuff in, you're in trouble.
The shards of volcanic glass are smaller than fine grains of sand. If you're close to the eruption, the shards will burn the lining of your lungs, causing rapid death. But further away, inhaling large amounts of volcanic ash will make it difficult to breathe, and that can kill you too. It will just take longer. Saving lives in a catastrophe is the responsibility of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, it was swept up in a storm of controversy. Ranked as one of the deadliest natural disasters in U.S. history, the agency was criticized for not being prepared. As a result, FEMA takes the threat of a Yellowstone eruption very seriously, mapping out the danger zones.
The innermost zone is the actual caldera.
Zone 1, closest to Yellowstone, would be suffocated by close to 2 meters of ash. It's home to 70,000 people.
There isn't time once it erupts. Ash cloud reaches these communities in a matter of minutes. You don't have the ability to get in your car and outrun the ash cloud like you see in the movies.
I'm sorry, the road is closed from here any further east. This is as far east as you can go.
Bausch's calm demeanor belies the terrifying predictions.
I don't see that there would be much survivability in Zone 1 if you weren't able to evacuate before the event.
Travel 100 kilometers further to Zone 2. Another 400,000 people are at risk for more than a meter of ash. There would be severe health problems like those suffered by victims of Mount Merapi in Indonesia. The deadly ash would spread quickly. By Zone 3, more than 1 million people would be exposed before even reaching a major city. In Zone 4, Salt Lake City would be crushed by 0.5 meter of ash, twice the amount needed to collapse a building. Nothing short of a concrete bunker would support the weight. In Zone 5, cities as far north as Calgary and Regina would be covered by up to 15 centimeters of ash. Even that amount can cause some roofs to collapse. Unable to go outside or travel, people would be trapped in vulnerable buildings. By the time the ash covers Zone 6, it would blanket an area from San Francisco to New York, from Dallas to Toronto, dumping up to 1 centimeter, irritating lungs and eyes. In total, at least 200 million people would be affected by the ash fallout directly from the volcano. If there is no warning and no evacuation, the human cost would be unimaginable. FEMA estimates the economic damages would total $3 trillion. more than all preceding American disasters combined.
We wouldn't care about these economic losses because we have millions of people in that immediate area and the survivability would be low.
Our food chain would be jeopardized. Crops in the 6 zones around Yellowstone would be severely damaged and potentially destroyed by the ash.
Well, the problem is that the breadbasket of North America is downwind from the Yellowstone volcano. And the ash that would cover the ground surface would destroy the growing season in the US and Canada, and the world's supply of grain would be in trouble.
Even if we had food, it would be next to impossible to distribute it throughout North America.
Airplanes wouldn't be able to fly in the stratosphere because there was ash there. Automobiles, their engines would get clogged with volcanic ash, so there'd be no trucks. In the middle of North America, there'd be no way to get food in or out of that zone.
It's just very difficult for human beings to do anything about. We can't control volcanoes. We don't know exactly where the wind is going to blow. It's hard to predict the effects of these kinds of eruptions. It's going to be a difficult situation for anybody who's trying to manage people's safety.
The most immediate threat to health would be the volume of ash. Canadian Raoul Singh has responded to natural disasters around the world. As a paramedic and director of the charity Global Medic, he's seen the effect volcanic ash can have firsthand.
You know that people are going to need food, water, shelter, access to primary health care. The main difference with a volcano, the ash. The ash is the killer.
If you don't die from inhaling the ash, the next thing you'd have to worry about is clean drinking water. The ash would contaminate rivers and lakes. Water would have to be filtered.
Our teams are specialty in providing people with access to clean drinking water and access to primary health care. The ash is going to give us tons of patients, but in 2 or 3 days, that ash is also going to wreck the water source of all those people. So that same patient that you may have treated on the first day of an event because the ash is what he inhaled and it made him short of breath and it's caused all kinds of problems. In 2 or 3 days, if you don't get clean water up and running, they're going to be a patient again.
The effects of a Yellowstone super eruption would not be limited to North America. They would be global, triggering catastrophic climate change. It's happened before.
The biggest volcanic eruption in historic times is the Tambora event of 1815 in Indonesia. And that was followed by global climatic cooling and failure of the crops in North America and in Europe. There was a famine in Western Europe. 1816 has been called the year without a summer.
Rampino looks at a slice of volcanic rock for clues to how previous volcanoes have changed the Earth. He paints a sobering view of life after an eruption.
Temperatures would drop on average around the world about 10 degrees Celsius. And in parts of the world, including Africa, for example, in the equatorial regions, the temperature effect would be even greater, 20 degrees Celsius change. Tropical vegetation could not cope with these freezing temperatures. All above-ground vegetation could be killed off. There'd be a 50% die-off of temperate forests. There might be 100% die-off in tropical rainforests. This would truly be, a catastrophic event on a global scale.
The lungs of the world would be in jeopardy. And it's not just ash. A supervolcanic eruption in Yellowstone would release sulfuric dioxide up into the stratosphere. In combination with water vapor, it would form aerosols that could block the sun from reaching Earth.
The indications are that the ash and the aerosols that are formed would stay in the upper atmosphere for 5 or 6 years. So imagine the production in Asia, the rice production. 5 or 6 years of little or no growing season, it would clearly cause a worldwide famine. You can imagine if the crops fail, there's going to be economic, political instabilities. And it's quite possible that an eruption like Yellowstone could trigger the end of civilization as we know it.
And it may all begin with ominous rumblings.
One of America's worst series of earthquakes in this century.
When we return, a witness to Yellowstone's fury.
This rock jumped over the picnic table and landed on top of their tent in like nothing flat.
Yellowstone's supervolcano is home to the largest concentration of geysers, bubbling mud pots, and earthquakes in the world. It's an indication this volcano is very much alive. An eruption could be the largest natural disaster in recorded history. It could trigger a volcanic winter, kill millions of people, and make most of North America uninhabitable. Martin Stryker knows all too well how dangerous Yellowstone can be.
One of America's worst series of earthquakes in this century felt throughout the Northwest.
In 1959, Martin was 15 years old on a family camping trip near Yellowstone. Just before midnight, he was startled awake. His two younger brothers were reading comic books by flashlight.
And I said, you know, what's going on? Is this a thunderstorm? And they said, yeah, we think so. And they just went back to what they were doing. But to me, it didn't feel right. So I got up and I went outside the tent and I looked right in front of me, and 10 feet away was our car, and on top of the car were two pine trees that had snapped off and were broken.
Martin's dad and his stepmom were sleeping in a tent nearby.
I saw that a boulder was sitting right on top of their tent, and the tent was totally covered by this boulder. I realized then that they'd been killed.
In Medicine River Canyon, 50 million tons of earth and rock, the top of an 8,000-foot mountain, thundered across a forest campground in one of the biggest landslides.
The landslide was the result of the quake measuring 7.5 on the Richter scale. It killed 28 people.
It shows the power of the initial quake because this rock had been jarred loose on the hillside, had run down the hill, jumped over the picnic table, and landed on top of their tent in like nothing flat. My instinct was to protect my brothers. And then when I took them outside and told them that Dad and Ethel had been killed, I mean, that was a heck of a shock. But I said, we can't stay around here. We have to get out of here. There was a lot of wind blowing. You could hear the trees snapping off like matchsticks around us. The dust in the air was really quite thick. It seemed like it was blowing up out of the fissures in the ground. We'd been to Old Faithful. We'd been to Yellowstone Lake. We'd seen bears. We'd seen bison. You just feel like, how did this happen? The next day, a sheriff and a ranger and a farmer came by, and they got a winch and they pulled the rocks back, and that was fairly traumatic to me.
The Hebgen Lake earthquake is a deadly reminder Yellowstone is up to something.
There's no way a supervolcano, or really any volcano for that matter, can erupt without causing earthquakes.
Deep beneath the surface, magma will try to make its way to the top. It will push and shove the rock around, producing earthquakes. It's normal for Yellowstone to have 3,000 earthquakes a year. But in 2008, there was an alarming increase. In just 2 weeks, thousands of quakes. An earthquake swarm rocked the area and put geophysicist Bob Smith on alert.
Front of the earthquake swarm is moving from south to north at about 1 kilometer a day, which is a very high rate.
The earthquakes were underneath a lake. And so that always kind of raises a red flag with the public, is because it's a little bit more mysterious when something's happening beneath a body of water. In addition, we could see that the earthquakes did migrate over time, and so that implies that maybe something's moving, maybe some fluid, maybe even some magma.
Whatever it did, it stopped. I was concerned that it was a failed earthquake sequence, that we're building up this long fracture zone, get enough stress, we could have had a much larger earthquake nucleating.
Then, in 2010, another alarm goes off.
Earthquakes have been rocking Yellowstone National Park all day. Researchers at the University of Utah say the park's in the middle of a swarm of quakes that started Sunday night. Since yesterday, seismologists say they recorded more than 200 quakes.
This time, the swarm lasted a month before it stopped. Since then, scientists have collected new data, giving them a better picture of this mysterious structure. Right beneath the caldera, from the last eruption, sits the magma chamber. It's bigger than they thought, and it's being fed by a plume of magma stretching down 750 kilometers northwest into Montana. It's mostly solid rock with the potential to liquefy. It's this plume, deep and dramatic, scientists are watching closely. Magma, or molten rock, is rising through it into the magma chamber at 5 centimeters a year.
But there's no reason for it to stop, although it might come in spurts. Our images show wider parts and narrower parts, so it's like slugs of material that are flowing in a sewer line. And this restless Yellowstone caldera is truly living, breathing, and every once in a while it burps.
The danger is if the plume starts liquefying and moving up at a faster rate.
Natural systems can throw us a lot of curveballs. A lot of things can happen that we're not really ready for.
Scientist Jake Lowenstern is looking for a pattern connecting the supervolcano today and its 3 prior eruptions, 2 million years ago, 1.3 million years ago, and 640,000 years ago.
In 2 of the really large eruptions at Yellowstone, so much material comes out, entire mountain ranges end up falling into the ground and essentially disappearing.
A stretch of mountains 80 kilometers long just vaporized into ash. Professor John Westgate has tracked ash from Yellowstone's prior eruptions.
It covered much of the United States. It occurs right out in the Pacific Ocean. It's even found in the Gulf of Mexico.
Not to mention the Canadian prairies.
In Regina, it's about 4 centimeters thick. Just an amazing deposit. These eruptions are enormous. The amount of material erupted from them, huge.
We are directly over Mount St. Helens right now, and there is no question at all that the volcanic activity has begun.
When the Mount St. Helens volcano erupted in May 1980, it blew off one side of the mountain and triggered an avalanche of snow, mud, and ash. 57 people were killed. The ash landed in 11 states and up into Canada. But that's nothing compared to the amount of ash from Yellowstone's last 3 major eruptions. Today, there's little evidence of the supervolcano's violent past. The caldera, the crater from the last eruption, is oval-shaped, covered by lava and ash, smoothed over by glaciers. Forests now cover the scars.
Putting my mark in for a seismograph station and a GPS point.
But this pastoral image of Yellowstone doesn't fool geophysicist Bob Smith. He's been watching the volcano for his entire career.
This thing's been active for 17 million years. And as we see it today, it's very dynamic. When you drive to Yellowstone from anywhere, you drive uphill onto this high plateau, and the plateau is essentially the top of the hotspot. It includes the earthquakes. It includes the concept of heat flow that's driving the geysers and hot springs, but it has its source deeper in the Earth's upper mantle.
The Earth is basically having hot flashes at hot spots. It's the way it conveniently cools off.
It's that mysterious heat source deep in the Earth that's fueling Yellowstone. North America is a series of tectonic plates moving at a speed of 2.5 centimeters per year in a southwesterly direction. As the plate system moves, cracks and fractures allow melted magma to make its way to the surface, creating the opportunity for an eruption. This plate movement has left a trail of volcanic eruptions in its wake, called a hotspot track. Volcanic eruptions along a stretch of 800 kilometers, a line of fire leading to Yellowstone.
All we see is what happens at the surface, but we don't know the actual players in detail of what's happening down below.
Geologist Hank Hessler, armed with an infrared camera, monitors just how hot the Earth is at the Norris Geyser Basin, even in the dead of winter.
Right here, much of Norris is at boiling temperatures, so a lot of heat, a lot of thermal energy coming from the molten rock that's right here beneath our feet.
300 meters underground, the temperature can reach 240 Celsius.
Yellowstone is still a tremendous heat source, and it's really a globally significant volcanic system. There is no place on Earth quite like Yellowstone.
After the break, is there any way to prepare for catastrophe?
One of the things you might want to do is to be able to store enough food to get you through the 5 or 6 years when there's going to be no growing season.
At Yellowstone, it's not the animals you really need to be afraid of. A supervolcanic eruption at Yellowstone would kill millions of people. Ash would damage crops, not only in the United States, but in Canada too. The estimated economic losses in the US alone are $3 trillion. The effects on the world economy would be equally catastrophic if a global volcanic winter was triggered by an eruption.
So, are we prepared for this event? Probably not.
Those living in the immediate area are somewhat philosophical about the threat.
If the caldera exploded, we might be decimated by the event itself and unable to respond, and we might be part of the disaster, not the solution to it.
But there are things that can be done if there's some warning.
It's feasible to keep everybody out of the park. Not an easy thing to do, but that's something they can plan for.
That's a big evacuation plan. And certainly things are going to go wrong. People are going to be killed in car accidents, for example, in the rush to get away from the volcano.
For people living in zones further away from the epicenter, including some parts of Canada, survivability would depend on having planned for the worst.
And I would say that the example of Japan has a number of very important lessons for us. They were not prepared for it. The earthquake was bigger, the tsunami was bigger. Based on the historic earthquake activity, they thought they really had a pretty good understanding of how things moved. And when they got a 9, the overwhelming majority of seismologist engineers were really, really surprised. We really do have to consider that the event may exceed our parameters. It's developing a culture of preparedness. It's not paranoia. It's not constantly thinking that something's going to happen, but simple things like having the ability to last on your own for a week, having food and supplies, having a kit in your car.
That's exactly the approach taken by the city of Vancouver. Sitting in an earthquake zone, it has its own problems to deal with. But Vancouver is also preparing for other threats, such as volcanic ash settling over the city.
We're very well aware of issues like Yellowstone. We spend more of our thoughts looking at the potential consequences of that occurring.
It might seem like a drop in the bucket, but they have 27 of these containers scattered around the city, stocked and ready for a natural disaster.
This is one of our emergency supply containers. There's first aid equipment, there's water, there's food. In the blue bags here, we've got a number of blankets. There's also some tents in here that, if people need that immediate shelter, they have the ability to get under cover and be protected from the elements.
Just what we keep in stock is enough to purify about 150 million liters of clean drinking water. You don't get folks clean water, people die. And it's as simple as that.
The Canadian charity Global Medic has responded to 60 natural disasters in 35 different countries around the world.
And one thing I could tell you as a uniform rule is no one's prepared enough. You and your family should be stockpiled for about 3 days, because that's probably what it's going to take the rest of our society to come and provide you with supplemental aid. One of the saving graces that we'll have in the urban areas will be the superstores that have such a stockpile of food, and that's going to be your first line of distribution.
There will be security issues as food becomes scarce after the initial supplies run out.
Food's tough to distribute at any time. I think back to Haiti when we had to use UN troops to roll down the streets just to protect our convoys of food, just so we could get them into community centers of makeshift cities.
A volcanic winter would cause long-term food shortages.
One of the things you might want to do if you're waiting for a supervolcanic eruption is to be able to store enough food to get you through the 5 or 6 years when there's going to be no growing season. But when the yields are high, we only have about 2 months worth of grain in storage in the United States and Canada. So we really have to make a major effort to stockpile enough foods and other materials.
Even if North America could stockpile enough food to last 5 to 6 years, that would be nearly impossible in India or Africa. Their survival may depend on international cooperation on everything from sharing food to emergency response. Raoul Singh says it's time for Ottawa to beef up resources for those on the front lines.
Practice is the best preparation. We've got great Canadian responders. There's not a shortage of disasters out there in the world. We need to refocus, we need to practice. And at the end of the day, if we've practiced enough, we'll be ready for the big one here, and it'll save that many more lives.
But compared to floods, forest fires, and ice storms, the federal government considers Yellowstone officially low risk. Even so, that doesn't mean Canada is completely ignoring the threat. In the event of an eruption, a series of alerts would be issued by Environment Canada's Montreal Volcanic Ash Advisory Centre. Meteorologist Dov Benjamin tracks possible Yellowstone scenarios. Ash expert John Westgate has come here to share what he knows about ash flow patterns from the past.
If I start the animation here, we'll see how the ash, which is released up to a height of 15 kilometers, crosses a good portion of North America, as well as the Atlantic Ocean, and makes it into Europe over the course of about 4 days.
This ash plume contains a very fine-grained ash.
The pattern that we're seeing here would change from day to day. As you can see here, on an hour-by-hour basis, the winds are quite different and become quite complex.
It's this type of ash that grounded planes for days after the 2010 Icelandic eruption. Planes that fly through it risk engine failure. Look what happened to a British Airways passenger jet engine in 1982. Today, the airline industry questions whether there is any level of ash safe enough to fly through. A Montreal company, MDS, may have a solution. It's the only company in the world ready to go into production with an ash protectant for engine blades. This simulation of a plane's engine blade encountering ash demonstrates only too well what ash can do to an unprotected engine. In just 5 minutes, the ash blasts a hole through the titanium. But after the blade has been coated by a special process, it's polished but intact. This could keep the planes in the air and save lives during another volcanic eruption. Coming up, how close can we get to an accurate prediction of when Yellowstone will erupt?
The last Yellowstone eruption was about 600,000 years ago, and the volcano seems to erupt every 600,000 years. So will that be in our lifetime, our children's lifetime, our grandchildren's?
A betting person may not put money on Yellowstone's imminent eruption, but Irish bookmakers have set odds at 66 to 1. Yellowstone may be a bit of a long shot, but bookies have been wrong before. As scientists learn more and more about the volcano's behavior, they're searching for clues that may help pinpoint the next eruption. Geophysicist David Menson is trying to decipher strange signals coming from Yellowstone Lake. Signals from instruments buried under the lake, way beneath the Earth's crust. Menson and his team couldn't believe the readings they started to get, mysterious messages from the deep.
We thought the instrument was malfunctioning until we noticed that it was showing up on all the instruments simultaneously.
It became clear that it was the lake making a wave, undetectable to the eye, but picked up by the instruments. Water moving back and forth, like water displaced in a bathtub.
The exciting part about this is that we have this giant mass, like a big piston going back and forth, and we don't understand what's forcing this to happen.
And it's not just the water making waves. The ground itself is on the move. Scientists discovered roughly a quarter of the caldera was rising right over the magma chamber.
It was about 25 centimeters over that entire 4 to 6 year period.
In 2010, the Earth slowly started going back down. No one's quite sure what's causing the Earth to rise up and fall.
People still argue about exactly what it means.
But does it mean Yellowstone's about to blow?
We know a major eruption will occur in the future, but exactly when, we don't know.
I do know that there will be volcanic eruptions again at Yellowstone. I don't think they're very likely to happen within my lifetime.
There's not an imminent threat that I know of.
The last Yellowstone eruption was about 600,000 years ago, and the volcano seems to erupt every 600,000 years. So will that be in our lifetime, our children's lifetime, our grandchildren's? We can't say for sure because we've never experienced in historic times an eruption that big.
For magma to make it up to the surface, it's going to have to break a lot of rock. There's going to be a lot of earthquakes.
We're going to see at least 6 weeks of reawakening. Increased earthquake activity, increased small-scale steam eruptions, ground swelling, gas emissions, because that's certainly what we saw in the case of St. Helens and Pinatubo.
But has the reawakening begun?
The difficult thing is always going to be understanding how big is this going to be, how big can it get, and that's not something that we really have that much experience with because we haven't had any eruptions in historic time that are of that kind of scale.
It's not surprising scientists and officials are reluctant to sound the alarm.
When you start to make comments about potential eruptions or indeed potential earthquakes, local administrative bodies get very, very upset. Real estate values drop, tourism decreases. I mean, you have real issues there.
I don't make the decisions to evacuate. I just tell the managers, here are the possibilities and here's the likelihood. It's up to you.
But what happens when scientists fail to sound the alarm? In 2009, in L'Aquila, Italy, a series of earthquake swarms were recorded in the months before a 6.3 earthquake shook the city. No evacuation was ordered. More than 300 people were killed. 6 seismologists and a government official were charged with manslaughter for failing to warn people about the deadly earthquake.
The only problem is we don't know enough about the warning signs of an impending eruption to be able to say, okay, now is the time to evacuate. You make a mistake and the volcano doesn't go off, then you've moved hundreds of thousands of people for no reason whatsoever. So politically, it might be a problem of who is going to make the call? The governor, the president, the local mayors? Who's going to make the call to begin to evacuate?
It's difficult often to get people to evacuate, even when you can see it coming.
The night before Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, people still ignored evacuation warnings.
So we're dealing with both uncertainty and we're dealing with human behavior.
It's a tough call to make, even with advanced warning. Take the case of the Mount Pinatubo eruption in 1991.
In that particular case, the monitoring worked and people were evacuated before the catastrophic eruption. But up until really the final hours, there was a lot of second guessing, a lot of concern that, are we really on the edge of a major eruption or not?
Even with what was considered a successful evacuation, 847 people were killed when roofs collapsed under the weight of wet ash. Yellowstone is predicted to be 100 times more powerful than Mount Pinatubo. Even if you knew the date, how do you evacuate most of the United States and parts of Canada? It's never been done before.
I always worry about how much error we have in our data. What's the variability in an answer? When I could answer you, I could say 50% chance in 10 days. But what if I'm off by 1,000%?
The threat is serious. I think we should be taking it seriously. And I think there should be an international conference on super eruptions to put together what we know about the volcanic eruptions of that size and what we don't know.
Hopefully the day never does come, but do we want to be looking back 20 years after the event and saying, boy, I wish we were better prepared?
People want to put their heads in the sand. They don't want to think about these super eruptions happening again. And we know for sure that that volcano is going to go off.
Every 90 minutes, Yellowstone's crown jewel, Old Faithful, goes off like clockwork. If only the rest of Yellowstone was this predictable. Remember, our documentaries are always playing at cbc.ca/DocZone. I'm Anne Marie McDonald. Thanks for joining us.
Sunday.
Hello again, Dragons.
Once burned, twice shy.
I'm gonna give you $1 million to shut up.
Past pitchers get one more try.
Remember me? Look at that.
50,000 for 40%.
The Dragon's Den Second Chance Show. Now on a new night, Sunday at 8 on CBC. Brought to you by Scotiabank. Sunday. On the season premiere of Republic of Doyle.
Stay strong.
Will things ever be the same?
All clear. Des.
Jake.
Republic of Doyle, part of Premiere Week. Sunday at 9 on CBC. The National starts now on CBC.